The Columbine High School Shooting, Littleton, Colorado, 1999. The loud echo of gunfire shattered the calm of an ordinary spring morning. At Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, chaos erupted in a matter of seconds. Students screamed as the sound bounced through the hallways, sharp, echoing, and terrifying. It was April 20th, 1999, a date that would soon become one of the darkest days in American history. Outside the school cafeteria, smoke and confusion filled the air. Two students, both wearing long black trench coats, were seen walking toward the entrance. They carried heavy bags filled with weapons. No one knew that inside those coats were the tools of a tragedy that would change the United States forever. As the first shots rang out, panic spread like wildfire. Teachers shouted for everyone to take cover. Some students ran, some hid under tables, others froze in shock. No one could understand what was happening. It felt unreal, like something out of a nightmare that no one could wake up from. Inside the library, the fear was overwhelming. The sounds of footsteps came closer. Someone whispered, "They're coming this way." Others prayed under their breath. The school, once filled with laughter, music, and the sound of lockers closing, had turned into a war zone. Police cars raced toward the school as 911 calls flooded in. Dispatchers heard terrified voices crying for help. "There's someone shooting inside the school!" The community of Littleton, a peaceful suburb just outside Denver, was thrown into panic. Parents rushed toward the school, hearts pounding, desperate to know if their children were safe. But inside, the horror continued. The two shooters, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, moved through the halls, armed with guns and homemade explosives. They had planned this attack for months. Their goal was not just to harm, but to make a statement, one filled with anger, revenge, and deep pain. As the minutes passed, the situation grew worse. Smoke filled the air from small explosions. Fire alarms blared. Students tried to escape through windows, climbing down from the second floor, while police and reporters gathered outside. One student, bleeding and terrified, whispered into a phone, "They're killing people in the library." That call became one of the most haunting recordings of the day. For 45 long minutes, terror ruled Columbine High School. SWAT teams surrounded the building, unsure of how many shooters were inside. Helicopters hovered above. News cameras broadcast the scene live across the nation. Millions of Americans watched in disbelief as the tragedy unfolded in real time. At 12:08 p.m., the gunfire stopped. Inside, 13 lives were lost, 12 students and one teacher, before the two attackers turned their weapons on themselves. It was a moment of silence that carried the weight of the nation's grief.
But this story doesn't begin with that silence. It began months earlier with two teenagers who felt invisible, angry, and rejected. They were smart but troubled, blending in just enough to go unnoticed. Beneath their quiet appearances, a storm was building, one that no one saw coming. Eric Harris was 18, charismatic, intelligent, but also deeply resentful. He spent hours online, creating violent writings and designing homemade bombs. His friend Dylan Klebold, 17, was shy and thoughtful, but carried a heavy sadness. Together, they found comfort in each other's frustration. At school, they were often teased and excluded. They felt different, unwanted, outsiders in their own world. Over time, their anger grew into something darker. They began to plan what they called Judgment Day, a day when they would take revenge on the people they believed had wronged them. They started collecting weapons and learning how to make explosives. They filmed videos, smiling into the camera and speaking about what they were going to do. In one of their tapes, Eric said, "This is going to be the best day of our lives." It was chilling, words that would later be shown in courtrooms and documentaries for years to come. On the morning of April 20th, 1999, Eric and Dylan loaded their car with guns, propane bombs, and ammunition. They dressed in black and drove to school as if it were any other day. They laughed in the car, listening to music, completely calm. By 11:10 a.m., they arrived at Columbine. They parked near the cafeteria and placed duffel bags containing homemade bombs inside. The plan was for those bombs to explode first, forcing students outside, where the two would then open fire. But something went wrong. The bombs didn't detonate. The timing failed, and so they decided to start shooting. As they pulled out their guns, the first students they targeted were outside enjoying lunch. The sound of bullets striking lockers and shattering glass echoed across the courtyard. People screamed and dropped to the ground. Others ran for cover behind cars. Inside, chaos spread faster than anyone could react. Teachers locked classroom doors, students hid under desks, and alarms filled the halls. The confusion was total. No one could tell where the danger was coming from. Police surrounded the school, but they didn't know how many shooters there were or where they were located. The 911 line stayed busy with calls from terrified students whispering into phones. Every few minutes, another gunshot could be heard. In the library, the heart of the horror was unfolding. The shooters entered, shouting and firing randomly. They laughed and mocked their victims, calling out questions before pulling the trigger. For those who survived, the memory of that moment would never fade. One teacher, Dave Sanders, tried to lead students to safety. He guided dozens of kids down a hallway toward an exit, but was shot before he could escape. He managed to crawl into a classroom where students stayed by his side until help arrived hours later. As the SWAT teams finally entered, they found a scene of heartbreak. Broken windows, smoke, and silence. The two attackers were dead, but the pain they left behind would haunt America for decades. Columbine wasn't just another news story. It became a turning point, a wake-up call for the nation. It forced schools, parents, and lawmakers to ask difficult questions about safety, mental health, and the dangers of isolation in young people. But before the nation could begin healing, investigators needed to understand why. What led two ordinary teenagers from Colorado to commit such an unthinkable act? As the police searched their homes and found their journals and tapes, a disturbing truth began to unfold, one that revealed just how far their anger had gone. The morning after the shooting, silence covered Littleton like a heavy cloud. The streets near Columbine High School were filled with police cars, reporters, and families searching for answers. Yellow tape surrounded the school, fluttering gently in the wind. Flowers and candles began to appear on the sidewalks, a growing sea of grief. Inside the building, investigators moved carefully through the halls that had been classrooms only a day earlier. Bullet holes marked the walls, papers were scattered, and backpacks lay open on the floor. It was a scene of shock, frozen in time. No one could understand how two teenage boys had turned their high school into a war zone. Detectives from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office began piecing together what had happened. Their first goal was to identify the attackers and find out why they did it. The names soon spread across the nation: Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, two seniors from Columbine High School. At first, people refused to believe it. Neighbors described them as quiet, polite, even friendly. But as police started searching their homes, a much darker story began to surface. In Eric's bedroom, officers found notebooks filled with violent drawings, detailed maps of the school, and a list of weapons. There were also computer files containing plans, bomb designs, and a website Eric had created, filled with angry messages and threats.
Dylan's room was quieter, but no less haunting. His journal revealed sadness, loneliness, and a deep desire to escape from the world. One entry read,
I don't fit in anywhere. I feel like I'm fading." Together, these two boys had built a secret world of rage and despair. Investigators soon discovered that Eric and Dylan had been planning their attack for more than a year. They had written about it, filmed videos, and practiced shooting in the mountains near their homes. They called their plan NBK, short for Natural Born Killers, after a violent movie they admired. In one of the recovered tapes, the two smiled at the camera as if they were making a movie. Eric spoke confidently, saying, "It's time to show the world what we can do." Dylan, standing beside him, nodded with a half smile. "We're going to be famous." The videos were disturbing, not just because of what they said, but because of how calm they were. They laughed, they joked, they talked about their classmates as if they were characters in a story they had written. Police learned that both teams had easy access to weapons. They bought guns through friends, taking advantage of loose gun laws at the time. They also purchased materials to make homemade bombs, which they tested in open fields. Their parents had no idea what was really happening. The more the investigation unfolded, the clearer it became. This was not a sudden act. It was planned with chilling precision. The shooters had even chosen the date carefully. April 20th was Adolf Hitler's birthday, a detail that shocked investigators and the public. As the evidence grew, so did the questions. How did no one notice the warning signs? Why weren't their threats taken seriously? Teachers recalled that Eric had often written violent stories for class. He once described a character who went on a killing spree. Some students remembered Dylan talking about death and saying he didn't plan to live past graduation. But no one thought it was real. They were just words, until it was too late. At the same time, the media was working non-stop. News channels replayed the same footage. Terrified students running from the school, police cars parked outside, and helicopters circling above. Talk shows debated everything: bullying, video games, music, and mental health. Everyone wanted someone to blame. In Littleton, the community tried to heal. Vigils were held at local churches. Thousands gathered to pray and comfort each other. President Bill Clinton addressed the nation, calling Columbine a call to action for all Americans. Yet for the families who lost loved ones, no speech could ease the pain. Parents clutched photos of their children, asking why. Survivors struggled with nightmares and guilt. Some couldn't return to school for months.
Meanwhile, inside police headquarters, investigators continued to dig. They uncovered dozens of videotapes labeled basement tapes, recorded by Eric and Dylan just weeks before the attack. In those tapes, the two explained their motives. Eric spoke with hatred toward society, saying he wanted to destroy as much as possible. He saw himself as superior, smarter than everyone else. Dylan, in contrast, looked tired, almost sad. He talked about feeling trapped and misunderstood. He said he didn't care about fame, he just wanted the pain to stop. When the tapes were finally played for law enforcement officials, many couldn't finish watching them. The cruelty, the certainty, and the lack of emotion were too much. The tapes were never released to the public, out of respect for the victims and to prevent copycats. But the questions continued. Could this have been stopped? Months later, new information surfaced. Reports that police had received complaints about Eric Harris long before the shooting. A neighbor had reported his website to authorities, saying it contained violent threats and bomb-making instructions. The sheriff's office had even written a draft warrant to search his home, but never followed through. That discovery caused outrage. Parents demanded to know why the system failed. The investigation revealed that opportunities to intervene had been missed time and time again. Columbine became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of the need for change. Schools across America began adding metal detectors, security cameras, and emergency plans. Teachers were trained to look for warning signs of isolation, anger, and depression in students. But while America tried to make sense of it all, one chilling truth lingered. Eric and Dylan wanted to inspire others. And sadly, in the years that followed, several other attackers would cite Columbine as their influence.
By the end of 1999, the Columbine Report, a 10,000-page investigation, was completed. It documented every detail: the weapons, the planning, the timeline. Yet even with all that information, one question could never be fully answered. Why did two young men choose to destroy so many innocent lives? As the halls of Columbine were repaired and students eventually returned, a quiet memorial was built nearby. On it were engraved the names of the victims, each representing a life cut short and a community forever changed. The town of Littleton would never be the same again, but the story of Columbine wasn't over. In the months that followed, survivors began speaking out, sharing their pain and memories. Their stories became a voice for others, a message about hope, healing, and the strength to move forward after unimaginable loss. Still, one haunting truth remained. Eric and Dylan had left behind something more than destruction. They had left behind questions that America still struggles to answer. The sun rose quietly over Littleton, Colorado, casting soft light on a town still trying to heal. The once busy Columbine High School stood silent, its windows repaired, but its spirit scarred. The sounds of laughter and locker slamming had been replaced by memorials, flowers, and moments of silence. For many survivors, the nightmare didn't end when the shooting stopped. It followed them into their dreams, their classrooms, and their memories. Some couldn't step back into the building for months. Others transferred to different schools altogether. Every hallway, every classroom brought back flashes of that terrifying day. Rachel Scott's name became one that many Americans would never forget. She was the first student killed that morning, known for her kindness and faith. Her friends began to share her story, spreading her message of compassion and forgiveness. Her family started Rachel's Challenge, a program encouraging kindness and empathy in schools nationwide. What began as grief slowly turned into a movement of hope.
Across the United States, people were searching for answers. How could such violence happen in a quiet suburban school? News programs aired interviews with survivors, psychologists, and police officers. Parents talked to their children about bullying, anger, and mental health, topics that were rarely discussed openly before Columbine. Inside classrooms across America, things began to change. Schools introduced lockdown drills and safety plans. Teachers were trained to recognize early warning signs in students, signs of loneliness, aggression, or withdrawal. Police began working more closely with schools to prevent future tragedies. Yet the emotional scars in Littleton were harder to heal. Survivors often described feelings of guilt. Guilt for surviving when their classmates didn't. Guilt for not being able to help. Some battled depression or post-traumatic stress. Counselors worked tirelessly, helping them piece their lives back together, one day at a time. One teacher, who had survived the attack, said in an interview, "Every time I walk into a classroom, I think about that day. But I teach because I want to remind my students that even after darkness, there can still be light." Memorial services were held every April 20th. Families gathered at Clement Park near the school, where a permanent memorial was later built. It became a quiet place for reflection, a circle of remembrance where the names of the 13 victims were engraved in stone. But while Littleton mourned, the rest of the country looked inward. Columbine had become more than a tragedy. It was a turning point. Politicians debated gun control and school security. News outlets discussed the influence of violent movies, video games, and internet culture. But psychologists warned that the issue ran deeper than that. Columbine was not just about weapons. It was about alienation. Two young men who felt unseen and unheard, whose pain grew unnoticed until it exploded into violence. That realization pushed schools and communities to pay closer attention to mental health. Programs were launched to help students find belonging and express their emotions safely.
Years later, survivors continued to share their experiences. Many spoke publicly for the first time, not to relive their trauma, but to prevent others from experiencing the same pain. Their voices became a source of courage for a new generation growing up in a world forever changed by Columbine. Some students went on to become counselors, teachers, and advocates for peace. Others stayed quiet, living private lives, still haunted by the memories. But all of them carried the same message: we must listen, care, and act before pain turns to tragedy. In documentaries and interviews, survivors described small details that stayed with them. The sound of footsteps, the smell of smoke, the sight of a friend's backpack left behind. Those memories were painful, but sharing them helped the healing process. Columbine also transformed how law enforcement responded to shootings. Before 1999, police were trained to wait for backup before entering a dangerous scene. After Columbine, that changed. Officers began training to move in immediately to stop the threat faster. This shift in tactics has saved countless lives in later incidents.
As the years passed, Columbine became both a warning and a lesson. Schools in every U.S. state developed active shooter plans. Federal grants funded mental health counseling for students. Parents became more aware of what their children were experiencing emotionally and online. Still, each time another school shooting happened in America, people thought back to that day in Littleton. They asked the same painful question: why again? The survivors of Columbine often said they never wanted to be remembered only as victims, but as voices for change. They believed the best way to honor the lives lost was to keep working toward a safer future. At the Columbine Memorial, visitors read these words engraved in stone: "It brought the nation to its knees, but now that we've gotten up, how have things changed?" Those words, spoken by a student years after the tragedy, still echo across the memorial. They remind everyone that remembrance must lead to action. 20 years later, on the 20th anniversary, thousands gathered once again at Columbine High School. Survivors stood side by side, some now adults with families of their own. They released white doves into the sky, one for each life lost. As the birds disappeared into the clouds, the crowd fell silent. In that silence, there was sorrow, but there was also strength. A promise that what happened would never be forgotten, and that those lost would continue to inspire hope. Today, Columbine is not just a story about tragedy. It's a story about the power of community, the importance of compassion, and the need to listen to one another before it's too late. It reminds America that even in the darkest moments, healing is possible, but only if we care enough to see the warning signs and stand together. As the final words of a survivor once said during a memorial speech, Columbine took so much from us, but it also taught us how to love deeper, live stronger, and never take another day for granted. And with that, the story of Columbine, though it will never truly end, continues to remind the world of the cost of silence, the strength of survivors, and the lasting impact of one day that changed America. 25 years have passed since that April morning, yet the memory of Columbine still feels fresh in America's heart. The world has changed, technology has advanced, and a new generation has grown up, but the lessons from Littleton, Colorado still echo loudly across classrooms, communities, and the national conscience. Today, when students practice lockdown drills or hear the sound of a school bell, some may not realize that these safety routines were born out of the tragedy that struck Columbine High School in 1999. That day changed how the United States viewed schools, safety, and the mental well-being of young people. It reshaped a generation's understanding of what it means to feel safe in a place meant for learning. In the years that followed, schools across the country transformed. Security cameras became common, doors were reinforced, and police officers,
now called school resource officers, began patrolling hallways. Yet the most important changes were not made of steel or glass. They were changes of the heart. How teachers, students, and parents learned to listen, to notice, and to care. Counselors started visiting classrooms to talk about mental health. Schools began offering safe spaces for students to open up about their struggles. The phrase, "see something, say something," became a promise, a reminder that silence can sometimes be more dangerous than words. Social media also changed the way stories like Columbine spread. Survivors used their voices to create online communities that focused on hope and prevention. They spoke in schools, on podcasts, and in documentaries, reminding the world that real healing takes time, but it starts with understanding. Rachel Scott's story continued to inspire millions. Her foundation, Rachel's Challenge, reached schools across all 50 states, encouraging acts of kindness to prevent violence and bullying. What began as one girl's dream became a national movement, one that showed that compassion could be more powerful than hate. In Littleton, the Columbine Memorial stands as a quiet symbol of resilience. The stone circle is surrounded by trees, benches, and the sound of wind passing softly through the leaves. Each engraved name carries a story of laughter, friendship, and promise. Visitors come from across the world to pay their respects, leaving flowers, notes, and photographs. Some cry quietly, others simply stand and listen to the silence that speaks louder than any words. Every April, the town still gathers. Bells ring 13 times for the victims, and families light candles as the sun sets behind the Rocky Mountains. There's grief, yes, but also gratitude for life, for community, for the chance to remember and rebuild. Columbine's legacy also lives in policy and awareness. Conversations about gun laws, school safety, and youth mental health became national priorities. Many schools created peer support programs, mental health hotlines, and conflict resolution teams. The goal was not only to prevent violence, but to build understanding, to catch pain before it turns into tragedy.
Still, every time another school shooting makes the news, the same question returns. What have we really learned? Survivors from Columbine often step forward, speaking with both sorrow and determination. They remind the world that remembering Columbine isn't about reliving pain. It's about using that memory to protect others. One survivor, now a teacher, once said, "I can't erase what happened, but I can make sure my students never feel unseen." That's how I honor those we lost. That spirit of turning pain into purpose is what keeps Columbine alive in the hearts of Americans. It's not just a story of loss. It's a story of courage, compassion, and community. It's a story that teaches us to reach out, to notice the quiet ones, and to never underestimate the power of kindness. In classrooms today, when students read about Columbine, many are shocked that it happened decades ago. They see photos of smiling teenagers, kids just like them, and realize how precious every moment of life truly is. Teachers use the story not to frighten, but to teach empathy, awareness, and resilience. As time goes on, the pain may fade, but the lessons remain. Columbine stands as a permanent chapter in America's story, one that reminds every parent, teacher, and student that change begins with understanding. The survivors of Columbine grew older, but they carried the memory with them, not as a burden, but as a reminder of how strong the human spirit can be. Their courage became a light for others walking through dark times. And so, as the sun sets over Littleton each year, the memorial glows softly in the evening light. The wind moves gently through the trees, and the mountains stand watch, silent, steady, and eternal. Columbine will always be remembered, not just as a tragedy, but as a turning point, a story that showed the world how pain can lead to purpose, and how even after unimaginable darkness, there can still be hope.
Because at its heart, the story of Columbine is not just about what was lost, it's about what we choose to remember and how we choose to live after. If this story moved you, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into real American crime stories that changed history. Every week, we uncover the truth behind the most shocking cases in the United States, stories of tragedy, justice, and the lessons we can't afford to forget. Your support helps us keep telling these powerful stories, one case at a time. Subscribe now and stay tuned for our next investigation on True Crime Chronicles USA. Because every story matters and every voice deserves to be heard.